welcome to the Ideal afternoon session. My name's Jane Blaseby. I'm Professor of Surgery in Bristol. I've had a long-standing link and interest in Ideal. I was at the Balliol with Peter at the Balliol College in 2009 here in Oxford, where the sun shined all 3 days. That whenever we came to Oxford, it was for 3 days on 4 occasions. It was always sunny. It was lovely. And it's been my privilege and pleasure to see Ideal develop and grow over the last 15 years or so. And this afternoon, and to me this is incredibly important, this next stage, as we think about how the Ideal framework fits with regulation and the governance of surgical innovation. And we're going to hear from some very key stakeholders about that, and there'll be opportunity for discussion. So without any more ado, as I say, I don't think Peter needs any further introduction. I'll just make sure he sticks to his time. Thank you very much, Peter. I look forward to hearing your comments, which are always thoughtful, and thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for making it through the multiple barriers in the way between here and London. Since one of our colleagues chose a road route, which took him 5.5 hours. Trains are good. I mentioned this aspect of discussion of the future for Ideal this morning in my introduction. We have learned a lot, and it came up repeatedly this morning, about the drivers for change in surgery and in all of medicine, and I'm afraid that evidence is not necessarily the top one. You've heard multiple examples of that. There are lots of other things that drive whether things change or don't. And one of the most important is the policies of powerful people and powerful institutions. Well, what Ideal does really is to promote the appropriate evaluation of complex interventions at every stage in the life cycle. That's our unique selling point, if you like. And it's fair to say that there are important organizations in the country who really need that. They just don't know it yet. So regulatory authorities, health tech assessment groups, and health insurance groups, including, that means, payers, so the NHS commissioners, all have an interest in objective data on the risks and benefits of treatments. So the policies of these groups are very important in deciding what other people do. All students, of course, revise for the test. They're only interested in what's going to be on the exam paper. As we've heard this morning when we've been talking about device evaluation and regulation, that applies in spades to people who are trying to bring new devices and robots to the market. But it follows for the other aspects of government regulation and support and indeed research as well. So we decided we needed to talk to policymakers. And of course, you've seen this slide before, but we have to think a bit about which parts of the Ideal framework policymakers might be interested in. The people we felt we needed to address were the regulators who dealt with approval of medical devices. So it used to be CE mark, and now we've got the MHRA's own British mark, whatever you want to call it. The people who do health technology assessment, and principally in this country we're talking about NICE, and the people who decide whether to pay for new innovations. So that's the NHS commissioners, as well as the people who fund most clinical research in the country, which is the NIHR. So when we decided to get involved with trying to have a dialogue with policymakers, those are the 4 groups that we targeted. And they are interested in evidence at different stages in the Ideal framework. So if you start with device regulations come up double. So if you start with double vision on device regulation, this is the sort of evidence that they are looking at in order to make a decision about device regulation. It's largely fairly early stage, a little bit of 2B, but rarely randomized trial, of course, the MDR may change that. But most of the evidence they're looking at is quite early stage and quite limited, as Alan Fraser pointed out this morning with some of the examples. And in health technology assessment, it's moving along the scale a bit. Now we're not looking really at preclinical studies. We're looking a lot more at early development and exploration studies, and in some cases randomized trials. So if you look at commissioning, it changes again. Here, commissioners are interested in whether something is worth paying for, and they're generally looking for a fairly solid level of evidence that whatever they bet on and decide to put money into isn't going to suddenly turn up with a whole load of new evidence that invalidates their decision. So we tried to engage with them, and we got some funding from RC UK to do that, and we set up an event which was supposed to take place in the spring of 2020, but the COVID epidemic intervened, and we eventually held it in October of that year as a virtual event. And we ran some expert workshops using sort of consensus focus group approach on regulation, HTA, commissioning, and research. And we invited members of the British industry group along to each of these. And we put out invitations to the call to quite a number of leaders in all of these areas, including the highest level. And this included Lucy Chappell, who I'm glad to say Jane Blaisby was influential in bringing to the conference. I don't know if you were prescient and knew she was going to be the next director at the time, but that was a pretty good call. And Stephen Powis, the medical director of NHS England. And we took advice from the university's policy people, because being a surgeon, I don't know much about what gets policy people excited. And the advice was pretty common sense, really, saying, look at what their objectives are, look at what their declared goals and plans are, and try to find common ground. And so the policy forum is really what has brought about the next few talks, because we did get good engagement, and we've ended up involved in a pilot study of how to use IDEAL in NHS commissioning, which Claire is going to touch on in her talk. The NIHR formed a working party to respond to our questions about what they thought IDEAL could do in terms of integration into NIHR policy, and Andrew's going to talk about that. And the MHRA were one of our more resistant customers because of the reasons I mentioned before. The turmoil over Brexit and the need to build a new policy from the ground up led them to being very tight-lipped about saying anything, but fortunately we have an escaped regulator in the form of Tom Melvin to talk about IDEAL and regulatory policy. So as you can see, what I'm doing essentially is giving you background and setting the scene and trying to explain how all of these talks gel together. I mentioned in the introduction that one of the things I would like to hear from you about is whether we should do more of this, and how and with whom. So I'm hoping that comes into the discussion later, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Any comments or questions to Peter just now? I went to the online meeting, and I found it incredibly valuable. And what happened, even though it was an online meeting, which is one of the downsides of online meetings, is it's sometimes difficult to make that personal connection with someone because you can't really have a public conversation with somebody in front of everyone. But I did manage to make a connection with the chair of the NICE IPAC committee, and NICE advise on policy or governance for surgical innovation. And so since that meeting, we've had 15 meetings with NICE, and we're about to go and see the Department of Health, so it was incredibly useful in terms of thinking about how innovation happens in the NHS, certainly from Bristol's point of view. So thank you for organising it, Peter. So our next speaker is Claire. Is that right? Got the order right? Claire, let me get this right, Cheong-Leen, who is a public health consultant advisor, and Claire's going to talk to us about ideal and decision making, I believe. Just get you on to the next one. There we go. Is that one, the right-hand one to go forward? Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm near the bottom of the pile of those very senior people that were on that list. But I'm the person that ends up having to try and implement things in real life. So I'm just going to focus on a little bit of what we do, but it's sort of, I think it's relevant, and we are, as Peter says, piloting, or trying to pilot, introducing IDEAL into NHS England Specialised Services Commissioning. And I guess what's interesting about specialised services is that I thought it would be useful just to give you a bit of NHS context at the moment. I guess not everybody in the audience is NHS England based, but I think partly the reason I'm going to give you the context is because I think when you think about can you use IDEAL and should you use IDEAL and what are the incentives, and Peter, you mentioned about your policy advisors telling you find out what buttons to press. These are the buttons that your commissioners are having to sort of deal with at the moment. So the big first thing is that however many 150 odd clinical commissioning groups, these small groups of sort of GP-led commissioners, they've gone, and we now have, I think, 40 odd integrated care systems. And the important word here is systems, and I think part of this is trying to move away from what has been for many years now a very competitive, them and us, commissioner versus provider sort of relationship. And so the idea is that the system model will help us to sort of develop system-wide solutions to common problems. And I think in the past, commissioners have often really struggled with dealing with, very big, powerful, strong providers because, we've been at odds with each other with different goals. The common purpose, I'll come on to that, but actually the idea is that this isn't just NHS, this is local authorities, this is social care, etc., all around the table as well. Part of that problem is just obviously it does mean that some of the commissioners that you might be trying to talk to are just incredibly busy working out if they've got a job or what their next job is. So temporarily you might have to pause some of your policy decisions or policy development. Now the other part of this is that there was a new duty put into NHS legislation in July this year, 2022. It's not rocket science to me. To me, this is public health. Public health is population health. It's about increasing the health and well-being of everybody, which makes it difficult if you're a very specialist clinician with a passion for one particular intervention in particular. Sustainable and efficient use of resources. So Muir Gray calls this stewardship. We're all in this together. We're all responsible for trying to do the best we can with the money that we've got. But actually, resources, we shouldn't just think about this as being money. This is actually also about capacity, infrastructure, beds, vacancies, staff vacancies. If you haven't got the nurses and you haven't got enough ODAs and you haven't got enough anaesthetists and you haven't got enough people to staff your ITU, it doesn't matter how brilliant your surgical procedure is if we can't actually kind of staff the whole pathway. And part of that then, improving the quality of healthcare services for all population, this triple aim is about clinical effectiveness and safety. And Pete, I was a little bit scared when you put your devices ellipse so far to the left, because everybody assumes, and I think we're involved in some work on digital interventions, apps and things, everybody assumes that they're safe. because nobody's taken a knife to anything and nobody's actually had to swallow anything. But actually some of those are really big assumptions and we should be careful. So the important thing here is that if you are part of the NHS, it is now the law for NHS organisations, including everybody in the ICS, to have regard for the wider effect of decisions. And so commissioners, when they're deciding whether to fund, WonderMab or the latest, or a new robotic intervention, then they need to take all of that into account. It's really interesting. We don't know what this will mean in real life, and it's never been challenged in law yet. But in law, if anybody uses the word must, it's much more serious than should, might, shall, may. And so we tend to take it a little bit more seriously. But you might be able to use that to your advantage as well. When you're selling ideal, when you're selling the need for better evidence, when you're selling the need for trials, because in that triangle was, quality and safety and, as well. So maybe you can use some of that as part of your dialogue. I guess part of that is, I've got to say this with my public health hat on, it's not just about the latest interventions and the good stuff. We still need to marry that whole story up with health need and also tackling health inequalities. And I guess never before has there been a bigger potential to widen the gap between those who have and those who do not at the moment. So I just, again, health need and health inequalities, that's absolutely on the radar of your commissioners, of your payers. I've borrowed this pie diagram from Better Value Healthcare from Muir's team, and I thought it was just really interesting that, we talk about inflation and we know we've got staff costs and all the rest of it, and heating the hospital is ever more expensive. But it was really interesting just to see that innovation is still the biggest driver of demand on UK healthcare. And I just thought in the context of that, it was useful just to think about, what does I'm calling it innovation because of course we deal with surgical procedures, with digital apps, with programs of healthcare, as well as medicines, etc. But what does when you're selling, because that's how it's going to come in the end, when you're selling your innovation, what does it improve? What problems does it solve? And I think, we're used to trying to improve clinical outcomes, but actually there's some other things that there are other boxes that you could tick. Robotic surgery might tick boxes on waiting lists or staff capacity. If more people can do a procedure than they could do before, that might make a dent in that. And that might be an attractive outcome to a payer or to a healthcare system. Bear in mind, less invasive surgery might mean that patients can get home sooner, that they need less social care or family care when they get home. So I think it's also then just thinking a little bit more broadly about what buttons to press. And, and I think the stewardship of resources is part of that. I guess the Accelerated Access Collaborative, which sits in NHS England, we've had some really interesting conversations there, also with the AHSNs, with the academic health science networks about, it's very much about trying to problem solve some of the workforce capacity issues, doing things differently. What can we do? How do we achieve the same? Not necessarily how do we achieve everything better, but how do we achieve the same, but differently and with less? What my team do for NHS England, and I think we've been doing it since about 2012, is we do rapid evidence reviews, so there's not a lot of money involved. They're quick turnaround, sort of 8 to 10 week pieces of work. But NHS England, as the Commissioner of Specialised Services, they want an independent, objective, impartial, rapid evidence review. And that's what we provide for them. And it's rigorous, it's very methodologically sort of strict. It's not that exciting. It's incredibly diverse. You know, I have an art project manager who holds us to time for absolutely everything, and we make sure that sort of every step is quality assured. I won't go through it in too much detail because it's probably, you know, bread and butter to sort of real researchers. What NHS England are not paying for, they're not paying for systematic reviews. They're just literally paying for, you know, a rapid, good quality literature review. And it's a literature review of the best evidence, not a literature review of all of the evidence. But I'll come on to that in a minute because it's relevant to helping us get past, you know, the impasse of where we are for some topics. So we'll go through, search and filter, go through the abstracts. We're currently reviewing 500 abstracts for a technique for mitral valve regurgitation at the moment. That's about 400 more than we were hoping, but never mind. And we're going to have to order 500 papers to get through that next step. NHS England hold us to an incredibly tight specification, so every single review is identical apart from the topic. The methodology is identical, but it means that it doesn't matter whether it's a surgical procedure or a device. We've just done a review on direct skeletal fixation, which is a way of fixing a prosthesis to somebody who would normally have a normal prosthetic for a limb prosthesis. We've recently looked at multi-grip robotic hands, and I think we're just about to start looking at sorafenib for an unlicensed indication for AML. So we're master of methodology and expert, but clinically we're not experts at any of this. If it's not in the evidence, if it's not in the paper, if you didn't write it, if you didn't publish it, we can't make up the gaps. I think that's the important thing. We'll go through. The important thing here is that in this whole 10-week turnaround process, in week 9, the clinicians get to see it. This is relevant because now what's going to happen with the mitral valve regurgitation, and we've just done it with the direct skeletal fixation, is the clinicians, they won't just see an evidence review now, they're going to see an evidence review and an ideal assessment, which they've never seen before. To be fair, we've never done one before. So we're all on a learning curve, and we talked about, you know, spreading the conversation about ideal. I can guarantee you they're going to look at it, possibly forget that Peter did a training session for some of them at some stage a few months ago, and go, what on earth is this? And we don't agree with it, and what does 2A or 2B mean? And we'll come, and they'll bombard us with questions. But that's what's going to happen. But it's important. But in a way, it's part of the dissemination. You know, it's a pilot. They'll see it. They'll see what it looks like, and hopefully it will prompt a question about, gosh, we've got lots of evidence, but it's all at 2A level. So we go through this rigorous process. We also, I don't know how many of you are ever familiar with grading outcomes. It's a kind of a systematic review type of thing. We grade the outcomes for even within a rapid evidence review. But I would also say, you know, at the point that you're thinking about, gosh, it's time to start moving on from 2A and 2B, think about what the outcomes are in your next round of proof of something working. Because NHS England are very strict, and you're not allowed. Who said that there were somebody earlier this morning said there were 20 different outcomes and 6 of them were reported and the others of 7 weren't. So was that you, Mariska? So NHS England are strict. They make you define the question right at the very beginning, and they only allow you 7 outcomes, you know, 4 critical outcomes and 3 important outcomes. And we're only allowed to report those. We're not allowed to report any other outcomes from the papers, and we have to report all of them, you know, but we have to report all of the results. So the pilot was set up. It was set up to evaluate what the added value and implications of the ideal framework might be, and the answer is we don't know yet. We've just started, but we've done, you know, or we've done a draft for direct skeletal fixation, mitral valve regurgitation. The paper on that will be ready round about Christmas time. Peter came and trained my team in Ideal. I think most people were familiar with it, but actually, you see, he's running away already. It's fair to say that the pedants and the methodologists in my team gave him a really hard grilling. And he was there for about 4 hours, kind of while they were saying, actually, how do you do it? Because the reality is, we never have RCTs. We have systematic reviews of rubbish, but we don't have RCTs. We don't have, if we're very lucky, there'll be 1 or 2 prospective studies, because this is all the stuff. It's not drugs. It's off-label. It's off-license. It's it's stuff that doesn't attract huge amounts of funding. So we deal with a lot of non-comparator and, in reality, retrospective case series at best. So I don't know where we're going to get to with this. We've got a manual now for exactly how to do it, and we may decide it needs tweaking or changing as we go through, but we're going to stick with it for at least the first few. And we've agreed with NHS England a template for how it's going to be reported, because, of course, they don't want to pay any money for this. So we do the evidence review, and then it's kind of, what can you do for 50p extra? And that's part of it. But we've come up with something really pragmatic. So part of that pragmatism is, taking some of the work that Peter and Alison, etc., had done already, putting it into a manual, and then for the DSF, for the direct skeletal fixation, we are literally reporting it as simply as this. So for each of the papers that we included in the evidence review, we've kind of done a sort of, actually it's better than a finger in the air. It's, but we've had a good stab at, is this a 2A or is it a 2B? And actually, clearly what's happening is that there's a blend of, what we're finding is these studies, there's a blend of 2A and 2B in all of them. And I don't think Peter had sort of warned us of that ahead of time, and maybe that was the need to give it a crack in the first place. The other limitation is that we don't include all of the papers that we find. We include enough of the best quality papers that we find in our reviews, because otherwise you can't turn it around in 8 weeks. And therefore, the rating, the ideal assessment rating that you will see is the rating for the best available evidence that we could turn around in that time. One might argue that that should be enough, because clearly if there was an RCT or if there were prospective cohort studies, we would have selected those. If all we've got is 8 case series and there's another 200 lurking in the background, it won't change the rating. So I think there's a pragmatic element to this. Could adding an ideal assessment help? I certainly hope so. There'll be prizes afterwards if anybody can guess the question or guess the topic. But, this was a topic that we reviewed in the last year. We waded through over 1,000 abstracts. Every single one of them, at best, was a case series. We ordered full papers for 114 of them, still having trawled through, and really struggled to find an excuse to include 8 of them. And the reality is that these 1,000 papers, published papers, were all published in the last 10 years. And the best of them would have come out at 2A. But what we've got is 1,000 authors who've all written about the same thing, about the same intervention and roughly the same patients. And from a commissioner's point of view, this is really disappointing, because I'm actually none the wiser about whether this is a safe, effective or cost-effective treatment. One of the questions, which was the same treatment, the same intervention for the same group of patients, but a slightly different indication. Again, we had to trawl through the 1,000 patients' papers, and we ended up not including any, because they just didn't answer the question. So part of what's missing, and maybe it comes back to starting earlier, which was the message this morning, is knowing what buttons to press, what the commissioner actually needs, what questions the commissioners need to be answered before adding to a volume of uncertainty. I think, you know, if your research, if your innovation, if your technique can help to contribute to system-wide solutions, then all the better. I think you'll be pressing buttons that people really need. You know, think about clinical outcomes, but think a little bit more widely than that as well. I've said we need to move away from a large volume of, you know, heterogeneous case series, which nobody can make any sense of, and certainly doesn't warrant, you know, prioritization or opportunity costs for other treatments. If you can inform your future trial design, absolutely. NHS England do have a relationship with NIHR. There's definitely a desire to sort of do pragmatic trials. That's really important, but you're going to have to get to, I think, 2B before you might be in the discussion about pragmatic NHS-funded pragmatic trials. And I know there are lots of conversations about real-world evaluation, real-world evidence, registries. I know that came up this morning, but I think there are pros and cons. You know, NHS England, we did an audit of registries for NHS England about 5 or 6 years ago. We found that there were 165 registries all relating to interventions that NHS England funded. We couldn't access any of the data for any of them. So that's a lot of money, really badly, with no return. So I'll come back to, you know, triple aim. One of the things that we talked, that was mentioned earlier was about, you know, that common goal, the policy maker, etc. But, you know, if we are all in this together and we were in difficult circumstances, then I think IDEAL needs to help the NHS, all of the NHS, to sort of manage the challenges that we have right now. I think that's where we are.
Thank you very much, Claire. I thought that was incredibly insightful, and it's given me a lot of thoughts of how big the problem is and what we can do about it.
Solve it.
Any quick? We're going to come back to some discussion later, but it's important. There's some really important methodological stuff there, which I think our team would be fascinated in. We're forever looking at the literature and working out whether something's what stage ideal study it is. It's impossible to tell.
I'm not sure we've cracked it.
Well, any comments or questions? Mariska, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah,
they all know you,
yeah.
right? Great.
You said we invest in so many registries. None of us, we could not enter any of them. What happened there?
I think some of it was historical. I think NHS England had funded them. The registries sit in different places, don't they? So one registry might be sitting with University of Liverpool, and another registry was sitting with a manufacturer and a private company that the manufacturer had contracted and all the rest of it. But what there wasn't. So the open access arrangements had not been funded, but what was happening was the NHS was, the idea was, the registries were set up as part of a condition, which is NHS England would pay for that particular treatment as long as all the data was collected, thinking that 3 years later you could analyse the data, decide whether it, you know, that would contribute to how well does this work, you know, does it do what it says on the tin, and then we would have moved forwards. But the reality was the data got collected, which must be eye-wateringly annoying for all the clinicians who've spent hours organising for the data to get to be sent as submitted, and just beyond infuriating for all the commissioners who then can't get the data to then answer the questions that they still have. So I would say don't go there.
Before you go, I'm going to ask you 3 methodological questions.
Okay.
3?
Oh my God.
I've got about 6 here. So, first of all, these are not in any particular order. Is this manual going to be published? Because that would be very valuable. About how you categorise them into an ideal stage.
We haven't even thought about that.
You must do that.
We should talk about that.
My next question,
Maybe
sorry,
with
don't go
Peter.
away, is I know exactly what it's like looking at these studies. How do you define a prospective study? No, it's asking what seems like a really obvious question, but when you're assessing a published paper, generously, you said, you've squeezed 8 in. in that review. You managed to find 8 out of 114.
Yeah, all retrospective.
An ideal 2A or 2B is a prospective study. How do you define a prospective
Well, for the
study?
direct, so for that example, Jane, we weren't doing ideal, and they wouldn't have made, and that wouldn't have made it into to anything.
Okay.
For the direct skeletal fixation, there were definitely prospective, genuinely recognisable prospective. There was a genuine prospective group of patients followed up.
So I know they're difficult questions and you're in charge and you're not the
fine.
person.
I QA a lot of them myself.
Because I know there's no answers, that's why I'm asking. So the next one is about outcomes. So you said you're really strict, which of course is very important, and that you pick so many and then you have some key secondaries.
So the important thing is we don't pick them. So here's the important thing, and this is where, so we use a standard, population intervention, comparator outcome sort of framework. NHS England, at the point that they're commissioning the evidence review from us, there's a draft PICO, research questions in the PICO, but there's a set template for it. And so the people that draft it are the clinicians, the specialist clinicians, but they have to work within the framework.
But my question for the methodologist dragging the outcomes out is, if there's an outcome that's defined in different ways, then how do they manage that?
We're incredibly accommodating.
Very well, good, okay. And sorry, one last thing, your rapid evidence reviews, are they publicly available?
They are, I think they're publicly available on the NHS England website, but they are not published separately.
One more question, and then I've got a question for everyone. And then
So I'm just jumping in because I was with Peter on one of these, and the 2A, 2B was the one that bedeviled my group as well. And I think it's because I think because 2As and 2Bs are so nebulous anyway.
Yes.
But I want to just echo something Maheska said earlier today that you brought in mind. Having done a simple evidence synthesis early on may have prevented 1,100 people from doing the 1,100 first case series. And it's just one of these things that it's interesting to tell people do an evidence synthesis before doing any research.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't have time. But then you see 1,200 case series, and you realize one person might have.
And I think that's almost where my team come in. We're quite good at these kind of fairly rapid, relatively cheap, sort of line in the sand, because actually, and I think that's all it is to a certain extent. It's a baseline. This is where we are right now, and then it's down to, the specialists to move that conversation on. The other thing that I think, this might be really naughty of me, but the other thing that I think contributes to the 1,000 abstracts is, as you qualify and as you go through training, there is this enormous pressure to publish. So you do, and it contributes to that volume. But I think it would just be great if there was a way of making that more progressive in any way.
And that's the question I've got for all of you, which we'll come back to in the discussion. It's that question: how do we stop that 1,000 single centre, single surgeon case series happening? Because it's such a waste of energy and it doesn't contribute to the evidence base, and it does mean things won't get commissioned because you'll look at it and think there's no decent evidence, and yet it might be trainees learning, needing to publish, but actually how do we stop that? So we'll come back to that, whether we need policy to stop it, whether we need trainee collaboratives to stop it, whether we need editors and journals to only publish things where they've got ethics approval that's prospective. There must be ways that we can try and stop this, but thank you very much.
No, that's really great, Jane. Thank you.
So Andrew Cook, welcome Andrew. Andrew's once upon a time was a surgeon, is now an epidemiologist, has a lot to do with funding committees and the NIHR, based in Southampton. Thank you very much. You're going to talk us a little bit about IDEAL and funding.
Thank you. Jane's very kind to describe me as a surgeon at one point. The highlight of my surgical career was in 1994 or 1995, where I took someone's appendix out. Been downhill since then. I sewed up a few slash wrists while I was in casualty. But the highlight of my surgery. I'm actually officially a public health physician. So we have a whole range of public health people up at the desk here. Name, email address if you want to contact me later. Twitter handle, should anyone still be on Twitter after the last couple of weeks. So feel free to tweet at me. I think I don't look at it very often, but it will push any messages to me. So I split my time between the National Institute for Health Research in the UK and Southampton Clinical Trials Unit, where I'm Associate Director. So I find myself both funding and doing clinical trials and other research projects. They don't, unfortunately, let me just take money out of one pocket and stick it in the other one. They're very good at setting up barriers to stop me funding myself directly. I'm aware we have a number of non-UK people in the UK, in the room today, and I presume online as well. So National Institute for Health and Care Research is the biggest funder in the UK of pragmatic clinical trials and other clinical research. It funds a lot of stuff. It's not just research projects, it's infrastructure. I imagine most people in the room are in the UK who are in receipt of funds. So for you, I am your funder. It's big and extensive, but what I'm going to talk about today is specifically interactions with the Health Technology Assessment Programme, which appears over there on the right, on the green bit of the screen. There's a number of programmes there that fund individual defined projects, and that's what we're talking about today. Peter's already discussed the policy workshop from a couple of years ago. This is the front page from the summary, and these are the relevant pages I'm picking up on. So Jane led a group at the workshop discussing NIHR and how NIHR and IDEAL might interact, and I'm not going to read the entire thing for you. It's all online, but as has been mentioned, Lucy Chappell was there. And Lucy was there because at the time she was the chair of one of the Health Technology Assessment Programme's commissioning boards. So every 4 months they get together, they look at a load of proposals for clinical trials and other research, and they'll spend £20 million maybe on funding 10 clinical trials. So she was there, she had an interest in IDEAL. You encouraged her to come, did you? And so she wanted to find out more about it. She was sort of interested, engaged. It's good to have somebody that high up in the system who might then push things. And then she got herself a new job. And several months later, she became the chief executive of NIHR. So she is now in charge and running it. She took over from Chris Whitty, who many of you will be aware of from TV news broadcasts during the pandemic. So, he moved on to be Chief Medical Officer. Lucy took over running NIHR. So here's an opportunity, someone who's already primed and interested in IDEAL, now in a position to be able to do something about it in one of, certainly on a UK basis, one of the key groups that IDEAL would like to influence. And Peter's never one to miss an opportunity. And I think Peter was possibly one of the earliest people to contact Lucy about this when she took up the post. So the email shot along to, I don't remember if it was the Department of Health or her university it went to. And then Lucy, having come into running a major £1 billion a year organisation without a huge amount of previous managerial experience, with so much on her plate, like all good managers, delegated. And so Lucy contacted Andrew Farmer. So Andrew Farmer is local. Those of you who are local probably know him. He's a professor of general practice in Oxford, but in this role, he's director of the NIHR Health Technology Assessment Programme. And that's, the view was at the time that HTA is one of the most relevant programmes as far as IDEAL goes. So HTA is the big pragmatic trial funder for the UK. Andrew also has lots on his plate, and so he delegated, what are we going to do about this, to Rupert Pearce, who's chair of one of the other funding committees, may have just taken over from Lucy, and me, because I'm around and I do stuff. And so we formed this working group, and we discussed with a number of people, including Peter, what we might be able to do, what's plausible within NIHR. NIHR, like all these big organisations, is very conservative. It's difficult to get it to move. But we have some prodding from the outside, some prodding from the top, some prodding from the middle. What could happen? The outcome of this process is this bulleted points of 6 points that ended up coming back to Peter and are being acted on. So the internal NIHR group liked IDEAL and wanted to encourage applicants, people who are engaging with as NIHR, to consider it. So, you know, we'll happily signpost. But if you're doing drug trials, it's probably not that relevant. If you're doing surgical trials, it's really relevant. If you're doing other complex intervention studies, I find it really useful. They're of the view that it's not something that should be mandated. You know, that there are competing frameworks out there. So the big one in the UK being the MRC Complex Intervention Framework. But if you start mandating things, you start stifling innovation elsewhere, I think was the view. It's rather like the EU has just mandated putting the same socket on the bottom of every phone. So that prohibits anybody else developing a better socket to go on the bottom of a phone. So we don't want to stop anything better coming along. It's very easy to signpost applicants just by writing things in paperwork. It becomes more compelling when you write to an applicant and say, we like your project and please change it in this way, or we didn't like your project, but if you change it, we might fund it. If you say, look at the IDEAL framework and put it in that context, that becomes more compelling for the applicants. And there's been encouragement among committees, and remember we've had committee chairs involved with this, to get that feedback to the applicants. And when you say, here's £1 million, if you read this document, people read the document. They're interested for methodological development. I believe Deborah Stocken is talking about methodological development tomorrow morning, so I'll leave that to Deborah to talk about. They thought it might be quite useful, certainly for UK-based people, if IDEAL flagged where you should take things at various stages in the funding opportunities that NIHR offers. Just sometimes, actually a lot of the time, you get very inappropriate things coming into the NIHR program. So if people know where they should be sending their requests for money, that would be useful. They suggest that. One of the things we did bring up was a specific commissioned call for IDEAL 2B studies. It's a big gap in the funding landscape in the UK is doing those IDEAL 2B studies. The clean ones, not the messy ones that you've just been talking about. So while this program will fund those, and there's an active one at the moment about pilonidal sinus, and I was tempted to put some photos up from that project, but I thought I'd spare you. So those are funded, but they didn't think that they wanted to put out a specific call. You're going to end up with a glut of people putting things in at stage 2B just because there's a call, but there is a history of funding those projects in the program. So after that, there have been some boilerplate updates. So there's standard text on the call documents that go out. Some of that's been updated. Feedback pointing to IDEAL has gone out from committees. I think more so than it did before. Too early to tell if that's going to result in any changes. This has been going on a few months now. We have a nice table, and this goes on through the floor, through the basement, through the foundations, taking the various research programs that NIHR offers and suggesting which IDEAL stages it matches up with and what sort of studies that people might like to refer to. So that is something at some point, I guess, IDEAL will be publicising to help people match up. So it's all very baby steps. But little things have happened. We're in a different position now than we were a couple of years ago. I think there is an openness. NIHR internally will review what's going on in a year or two after some of these effects have had a chance to take place. And then when they've done that, there's an opportunity of another prod. We might get that 2B call at some point. We'll see what the manifestation has ended up being. But there's been a small move. Here comes my details again. If anybody wants to get in contact in either of those two ways, they're reasonably reliable. I look at my email every month or so, so I will get back to you at some point. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Oh, questions? And please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's Hani, one of the neurosurgeons speaking earlier. I think that was a fantastic talk, and as someone who's often applied and been rejected from the NIHR, it's
really we're really good at rejecting people.
Really great for me to hear there are IDEAL-centric people there. I wondered whether there may be an opportunity having someone in the NIHR to join this up a little bit, because often the problem is that you'll have an isolated study and then that body of work will die a death at that point. And if you have an organization which says this is a good idea and we'll pick up this on stage 1, and if it works we'll fund you for stage 2A and 2B and 3 and then a registry, then that way a device will have evaluation properly and done the right way.
And here you hit the conservative nature of NIHR, because it just wasn't designed that way. And so to change the systems I've been talking about is, it's pushing a boulder uphill. Now, there are bits of this that will pick things up and take them through. So BRCs, for example, in particular areas, biomedical research collaborations, might be able to do some of that early stage push and get an investigator to the point where they could go to EMI, which is efficacy studies, or HTA, which is effectiveness studies. But there isn't a combined bit inside NIHR. If you're in the States and doing the National Institute of Health, I guess there might be, because they go on a disease categorization basis. Whereas the UK splits up by stage of technology. It's a different division which has different pros and cons. You've identified a con.
Thank you.
But that's something, I've been asked to speak into this, it's something that we could aim to convince the NIHR needs to be done by some demonstration models, and the other way it could be done is within a programme grant.
So a programme grant, which is one of those programmes, will fund 5, maybe more years of multiple stage projects. So it probably wouldn't go as early as 0 and 1, but you could probably, at stage 2, you might be able to get something going 2B, 3, 4 inside a programme grant, potentially.
So that's some of our ambitions to do in Bristol, and then to demonstrate that model and to have shared learning as we go. So you might start off with a platform type early phase study design, and then you lose the ones that aren't working and take it through the ones that are. Because the translational pathway in surgery and invasive procedures is what needs sorting out, as we've just heard, to stop our 1,000 2A studies. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That was great. I enjoyed the slides. Thank you, Andrew.
I'm sure you missed the Caroline.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Janet Martin, who I understand is a public health. You're going to have to introduce yourself a bit. I'm a public health expert, and she's going to be talking about ideal and decision making.
Excellent. Thank you for the opportunity to share this with you today. So I am faculty in the Department of Anesthesia and Perioperative Medicine and Epidemiology Biostatistics. My main role there is as clinical epidemiologist, and so teaching as well as research and implementation, and a small service component as well. Now, throughout the various parts of my professional career, I've had an opportunity to also consult with our Ministry of Health of Ontario, other ministries of health across Canada, and have been asked to write a white paper for the Canadian government on this particular idea as well. So what I'm going to share with you today really comes from our experience in implementing not only health technology assessment, but also decision-making and priority setting around what gets taken up into practice, as well as what research will be funded or supported within our hospital system. And then that has, as you will see towards the end, has really allowed us to incorporate IDEAL throughout this whole iterative process. But I do need to tell you the whole story and sort of tell you how we have developed into this evidence-informed, not only priority setting and uptake process and implementation process, but also how we combine that with decision-making in research priority setting. And then how does that fit in with our CIHR as well as our ministries of health? So it's going to be very high level quite fast because we just have a short time. And yes, we did this initially locally, and more recently I've been interested in doing this on a global stage because I think there is so much richness here And if we could and would just join up our efforts, I really think that we could be doing this so much more effectively on a global stage. And I know Will Bolton will be sharing so much more about that tomorrow because he's done a lot of work in that area. But I really think what I'm going to be speaking to does take off where Claire had sort of left off. And I think you'll see what we've done is a bit different, but it has a lot of overlap. And if we could actually share these efforts, we could reduce so much research waste, as well as so much angst around decision making, if we all shared sort of our registries, or not only our registries, but also our evidence syntheses to understand globally where are we at, which countries have done zeros and ones and 2As and 2Bs and so on. Because I think we're doing a lot of duplicative effort in that regard. So I'm calling this IDEAL plus No4Go, which I'll tell you about, iteratively applied, especially in surgery, anesthesia, and critical care, and it's really for innovation and research, decision-making, and implementation. But I need to start from the beginning. So in the beginning was the robot, and surgeons saw that it was made in the likeness of him, and he saw that it was good. And so it was entered into London, Ontario. Fast forward 24 years, and it has gone forth and multiplied. So much to the effect that we are now the highest per capita city, robot per capita. So many robots that even my first office in the hospital was filled with robot consult carcasses. I had a little corner with a desk. And I called it my pet paperweights. But you know, robots entered into London, Ontario in our hospital system with the promise that we would be a lead in evidence generation. Now, after all was said and done, a lot was said, but lesser was done in that regard. 24 years later, only a few studies exist, very few from our center. And of those, there really have been a lot of phase 1, 2A repeat and circular, and nothing really gained. And so it's this common problem, isn't it, with a lot of technologies, shiny and new. We idolize the shiny and new. Our fascination with the shiny and new means that we always feel yes is better than a no when we're looking at a new technology, which has purported advantages, sure does look nice. But if we always have a yes, 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 then everything becomes sort of a one-way valve in terms of decision-making, especially in the hospital setting, where everything is in and nothing comes out, or it ends up in my office. So we do have this problem with the technology hype cycle, where we have this peak of inflated expectations, but if we take up things too soon, too fast, before the evidence has sufficiently accrued, and before it is sort of an orderly, we hope, progression of the evidence through the ideal phases, then what can happen is we put it into practice too soon, too fast, ahead of the supports around it, ahead of the workflow, and we can actually do more harm and drop into this trough of disillusionment where we might actually lose very good technologies while we wallow around in terms of the things that didn't work out as we had planned, or if safety issues arise, or we cannot fund it appropriately. So could we expedite this towards a plateau of productivity? And we hypothesized that we could do better. We also found that there was just this constant expansionary pressure with new technologies. New tech is fun, and sooner seems better than later, and leading edge is our responsibility. We're a teaching center. So what's not to love about that? And we know innovation is necessary, but not innovation in terms of stealth research. So stealth research is masquerading as innovation. And we try to use the word innovation and evaluation as two sides of the same coin, because without real research, we don't really know whether it is a true innovation. So stealth research doesn't represent progress, right? In reality, it reduces our innovation efficiency. And that has been one of the biggest barriers of the past, is that when we sit around the table to evaluate something, there's always this initial set of antibodies that arise amongst the surgeon or anesthesia colleagues who want to use new innovations. suggesting that, well, their innovation might fail the test. But the point here is that it's not about passing and failing, it's about finding what works, so that we can get that into practice sooner, faster. And we know that technology enters the hospital before the market, so we actually need to be in our hospital setting willing to do this type of decision making and innovation and research and priority setting all mixed together, and with the ideal process running through it. And we know that if we wait until technology enters the market, that's the most inefficient way for meaningful innovation, right? Because the innovation and evaluation happens so much in the hospital setting. So Buxton's Law, you've all heard it, it's always too soon until it's too late. Uptake is difficult, disinvestment even more so. Breaking up is hard to do. How do we get rid of the things that didn't deliver on their promise? Or how do we even know they didn't deliver on their promise if we're not doing this? And you can't have everything. Where would you put it, for one? And if you try to do everything, in the end, you have nothing. So every decision is a decision to do, one thing is a decision not to do another. And this applies to investment just as it does to disinvestment, just as much as it does to implementing something as it does to prioritizing research. So what we moved on to was an evidence-informed innovation and implementation agenda, rigorous assessment of all the technologies by appropriately synthesizing all the valid evidence alongside our research priorities. And this allowed us then to, we hope, move beyond the technology idolatry, but also beyond this P less than 0.05 idolatry. So, how did we do this? Well, moving from evidence-based medicine to no-for-go with IDEAL running through it. So we found back then that even talking about an evidence-informed process was too technical, too linear, too blunt in and of itself, and that we needed evidence from expanded domains of influence, including the social, the legal, the ethical, institutional, workflow issues, learning curve issues. We needed to get those straight as well, right at the same time that we are evaluating the technology. And we also, and this was the most important thing of all, we needed to be able to enumerate and quantify our opportunity costs. These things had to be made explicit before we could make decisions reasonably. So where did we move to? Well, we started out with this very linear evidence-based process where we synthesized the evidence for benefit versus risk. We also then added in cost effectiveness and budget impact analysis. But after we had done that for a number of years, we found that we also needed to move into the areas where the evidence of the day had not yet dared to go, and that was to evaluate the sleepers. SLEEPers is an acronym for the social aspects, the legal, ethical, environmental, and institutional workflow aspects, cultural aspects, political aspects, and the entrepreneurial research innovation aspects, which is where we did a mini value of information analysis to figure out whether or not there is value in this innovation even before everything is all figured out. And lastly, the stickiness and sustainability factors. So again, we were quantifying every decision is to do one thing is a decision not to do another, and it needed to be based on benefit, risk, and opportunity cost. And we called this no for go because we decided that we needed to understand these four domains before we knew whether a decision for a technology or technique should be a no and go or a no-go. And it needed to be based on those four domains, and you can see based on Claire's demonstration, how IDEAL can now actually flow through each of these domains. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So you'll notice that we put cost in this algorithm. It's actually not an algorithm, but in this process, cost being the sacrifice of consequences and the next best alternative use of resources. This is our opportunity cost for every decision to do one thing, a decision not to do another. And this really has been where the clarity has come in and where IDEAL has been such a foundational part of the process. So when we're evaluating a technology or a technique, what we do is we actually plot it on this plane, this trade-off table. And it simply is a budget impact or some index of resource requirement within our particular hospital system. And then on the x-axis, the benefit index. And if we know what those parameters are, then we can actually plot things. So the blue ball would be something that has a large budget impact but no known benefit index, whereas the green would be where there is no net benefit known and no budget impact net. But more things come in where the red ball is, somewhere along that go, no-go line, and it does have some proven benefit, net benefit, but also a net resource impact. And so that go, no-go line out there is a line that defines itself based on all of the things that we accept and put into practice. And so with time, we have plotted a number of technologies and techniques on this same trade-off table. And you can see that it gets messier and messier with time, but you can see that the white balls are things that are now under consideration because they themselves have proven benefit, but a net resource savings or release back to the institution. And the black and gray balls are also things under consideration and things that we may also already have put into practice or are considering today, but for which there is a net budget impact but no net benefit index, some of them even harmful. So you can see that this is sort of a fingerprint now of our priorities, because we know the things that should be taken up into practice in terms of known net benefit and budget impact. And then the white balls become our prioritization index because they're the things that we're foregoing that we have not said yes to, but which could themselves result in lives saved or resources released back to the institution. So just quickly, we also take a look at the sleepers, so the social, legal, ethical, environmental, institutional, political, entrepreneurial, research, innovation value, and research opportunity, and stickiness, sustainability factors. We do this separately for clinicians as for our administrative and management staff, and we do this before we set out to evaluate an intervention so we can hear what the greatest concerns are, because sleepers really are those very emotive issues that sort of are beyond the linear evidence base, for which we need to understand where the antibodies are and where the concerns are in and amongst our colleagues so that we actually address those by the evidence or through commissioning evidence to be generated. And then we also evaluate these same things after the fact and see whether or not, as we move through the process, whether or not the opinions on these regards had changed as we discover the evidence and as we take a look at the medical legal implications and the cultural institutional aspects all in. So this is one way of ascertaining what are the likely rebuttals going to be in a very orderly fashion so that we can then systematically address them as we go through. So that's it in a nutshell, and this really then does become a contextualized assessment. And I didn't tell you there, but it's actually very important, is when you're taking a look at that footprint of decisions, this is a dynamic decision-making app whereby now evidence never stays the same, and neither do the resource implications, and neither does the ideal stage. And the ideal stage here, you can tell by the color of the ball for the, so each technology or technique is represented by a ball, telescoped by the amount of uncertainty. Okay, so the ideal stage is embedded in there, and that's, we routinely talk about that. So, to finish, what did we do about robotic surgery? Well, it's amazing because robotic surgery has been one of our greatest challenges and is itself still in a stage where we're at stage 1, 2A, and repeat. And we are still in a cycle whereby the things that are first in human are celebrated by news events and by ribbon cutting in our institution, and we haven't really done a great job of moving beyond that. And I've still had a number of surgeons come to me and say, help me show that this works. I've got my series of 31 patients here. Please show me that it works. And yes, we do just about all of the procedures, but again, stage 1, stage 2A. And that's why I'm saying I think if we joined up globally, because one of the lessons learned is that we spend a lot of time on the ideal framework, and I think a lot of you do too, and if we shared this knowledge, that would be really important. This was one of our mapping exercises. We also find that if we could elevate this to the global level, we could then do a lot of contextual analyses and also have enough power to answer these questions sooner, faster, because there is no way at my center, even though we are the largest in Canada, that we'll ever be able to answer these questions because our value of further information analyses have shown that we really cannot move the evidence dial on most of our phase 2Bs. So that's in a nutshell. You can see IDEAL embedded in there. Our surgeons have indicated relief that the decisions, once they're here on the table, that at least they're not a final decision because it's a dynamic table, and they also understand where they need to get to in order to be under the go, no-go line. And it means that no decision is final. So with that, I'm also going to close, and I think I have a lessons learned here. Yes. So one of the benefits of this has been that it is a multidisciplinary collaborative process, and we hope to bring in more practitioner or policymaker influence here. It is multi-criteria, ensures that decisions are embedded in the evidence, but also the economics and the sleepers and the ideal phase. Decisions are always live and also allows for context to be embedded. Thank you very much.
That was amazing, and I wish the NHS could adopt this, which I'm sure won't be possible, is it?
We actually do quite a lot of this, Janet. We've been swapping notes for
Good.
a few years. We just focused on one bit of it. I was just amazed that you talked about robots as well, because I think we've just finished our 8th evidence review of robots. There's a theme.
And we've done one in Bristol, a massive one, Natalie's
So
done
there's
one.
a fantastic, I think your point about the let's share, there must be a way to do that.
Yeah. Just before we think, Peter's given me was doing this because I was asking you too many questions. So what we need to do about the tea break and the next talk, or can we run over, is the question. Because it's scheduled for now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to stop us from running over a bit. Sorry, Tom.
The other thing, Peter, is that the sandpit session is a bit flexible.
Yeah.
You know, that could be shortened over some of the stuff. I actually questions and answers.
Because
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's no hard stop at the end of the day. The sessions are consecutive after the tea break. When you go back, you'll find the room's being rearranged. You just take your tea or coffee and sit down and crack on. So I think.
So should we carry on, or should we stop for tea?
I think it would be best if
Do
we carried on.
Okay. Can we do? Anyone else want to ask Janet a question? Because that was amazing. I just wanted to check.
I just want to say it's great, actually. The illustrations are really lovely.
Really lovely.
Before, but it's really nice to visualize some data.
Really, very, very
I'd just
accessible.
like to know if anyone's copied you.
Well, we will.
So there was a part that I didn't have a chance to say, and that is we are seeking funding for broader access to this app development, and also with our CIHR to embed this process, including IDEAL, into the evaluation process. And the robotic surgery, I think, I also didn't tell you, but the reason that it continues in our institution, and a couple of things that we did change, we decided to be an educational and proctor lead. We did some learning curve analyses, which have been influencing that as part of the sleepers, which then has allowed it to be within the under the go, no-go line in terms of value add.
Thank you. Mariska, I'm keen to have a question. Yeah.
Two questions related to your go, no-go. How do you prioritize in the go? But even more important, how do you preclude that the no-go are implemented? Because Canada has, like the Netherlands, an open system. So a lot of those innovations will go into the open system anyways, although it's a no-go in your graph.
Yeah, a lot of incentivization comes through the fact that we are so budget limited, and that's why I am very passionate about health technology assessment and implementation of investment and disinvestment decisions need to happen where the budget flows, because that is where the rubber meets the road. And so in hospitals, we have to find a way to live within our budget. And so there is incentive to get the balls that are above the go, no-go line out of practice. And it's amazing. It's a culture change where other groups, if they have their pet project on the table and they see something that is of lower value than them on the no-go graph, and that it is a black or a gray ball, or it's colored above the go, no-go line, there is some pressure there. to have that come out if it could release resources back to invest in something of better value.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you for coming all this way as well. I guess you've made that journey, so thank you for doing that too. Thank you. And our final speaker is Tom Melvin from Ireland, and he's going to talk to us about IDEAL and more about devices.
There we go. Hi everyone, I'll try and keep this as concise, which is dangerous for an ex-regulator. And thank you, Peter, for the invitation. I'm that escaped regulator. I work in Trinity College in Dublin, separate to this one. This is a post I took up in April. Before that, I worked as a regulator for 7 years, and I chaired the clinical evidence working group of device regulators in Europe. So I got to see the end negotiations of the new regulation that's come in. And I also got to work for 5 years on trying to implement it, especially with a clinical focus. I don't have a slide, apologies, but I should just mention, in terms of disclosures, I am an unpaid advisor for a startup called Pump in Heart, and I've done some paid training for notified bodies on clinical evidence. So I guess to briefly introduce what I was going to talk about today, there's a huge amount going on with medical device regulation in Europe, also a huge amount of change likely or possible, at least in the UK. So I guess I'll introduce that a little bit. What are some of the big things that have changed with the rules regarding clinical evidence under the medical device regulation? What are the challenges that we're seeing in the sector for manufacturers applying the new rules and notified bodies and authorities and assessing them? And then I guess it's more of I'm blue skying it a little bit and trying to think, where are the areas in which medical device regulation, which has had some changes in terms of the clinical evidence expectations, where might that overlap with IDEAL, and what might be the opportunities? So I guess just a brief introduction. We used to have the medical device directives in Europe, and we've moved to a regulation-based system. So we have the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostics regulation. The in vitro diagnostics one has a much longer timeline that was amended after its publication. And for the medical device regulation, it came into effect in May of last year, but it has what's called a transition period, so things that are marketed under the old regime and what's called certificates, which is your enablement to market, that can continue until at the latest May of 2024. And what we're finding is that there's a number of challenges in the system in terms of capacity to get on the market. So, the device world, many of you will probably be aware, is very different to the drug world. To get to market, you don't go through an agency like the European Medicines Agency or MHRA. You go to entities called notified bodies, and we don't have enough of them in Europe at the moment. I guess I'm not going to go into huge detail on legal text and that kind of thing. Time wouldn't allow and you'd fall asleep. But essentially, with the new regulation, one of the things that I see, even established companies and lots of people challenging or being challenged by, is that although the fundamental nature of the system is the same, we still have the notified bodies and authorities, and it's the same general structure. All of the small detail has changed. There isn't one definition as we've gone from the directive to the regulation that has stayed the same. So when you look at it and stand back, it looks quite similar, but when you actually get into the detail of working with the regulation, it's quite different. There's a lot of things that were introduced as kind of bolt-ons to the old directive system. So there's things like an expert panel. So when a medical device has been assessed by the notified body and they're happy to allow it to be marketed, these go off to an independent expert panel who do a review. So that process is active, but expert panels to give advice for device developers, it's written in law, but it's not available yet. So there's a lot of things where the law is applied now, but a lot of the regulatory infrastructure to make it truly work isn't really there yet. I guess the other big example in that sense is the centralized database called UDEMED. That's only partially available on a voluntary level, and yet that would be a really important thing to make the system work effectively, because it's where things like clinical study reports, things that would support transparency, in the future they'll be available via a Central European database and website, but that's not built yet. So the system is running, but the infrastructure isn't quite there. I guess it's really important to remember also, especially when I'm here, that both the UK and the Swiss systems are undergoing a redesign as we speak. So When I talk to people who are following what's happening in Switzerland, the agency there, Swissmedic, may well start to accept products approved in the United States, as well as CE marked or European approved products, which would be a huge change for, I guess, an agency that used to be a big part of regulatory activity. I think it's a little bit less certain, or at least I'm a little less certain as to what the UK system will look like. I'd suspect, if I had to guess, that it will be quite similar to the EU one, and that's likely to be somewhat necessary, because in order to allow as much freedom of access to the market as possible and to avoid big disincentives for companies, it will have to be reasonably well aligned, but I guess that's still under development and we'll have to see. And as a result of these changes, that creates both opportunities and risks for how you can shape the regulations. Especially here in the UK, you have, believe it or not, a great opportunity now to try and bring in some of the better methodologies for clinical science. So what's changed for clinical evidence as we go from the old regime to the new regime? So I guess this just kind of highlights a little bit. So this sounds quite dry, but even the change in definition of clinical data is an important one. We used to have a definition of clinical data that included things like published and or unpublished reports. So anything written down basically could be clinical data that you could use for your evaluation to come to market. That's changed and it's been tightened, I guess, so it has to be data from peer-reviewed or scientific literature. The need for a study and the ability to claim equivalence. So one of the big things when I talk to people with a clinical science focus is that, in my experience working as a regulator, many products used to come to market with no clinical study to support it at all, because they based their clinical evaluation entirely on equivalence, where they said, I'm the same as this other device and therefore I can use the data associated with that. And under the previous system, it was a far too liberal use of equivalence. Going through the legislation for the new regulation, what they did is they said for high-risk products, if you want to claim equivalence now, you need to go to your alternative company or your competitor often and have a contract with them to get full access to their technical documentation. So there's a big question as to whether anyone will actually follow that pathway anymore. And what we're finding is that the general need for a clinical study has increased, but knowing exactly the type of study design or the methodology is not clear in the law. It says you have to have sufficient clinical data, and if you're a high-risk device and you can't claim equivalence, you have to do a study, but it kind of stops there. We mentioned the expert panels already and transparency rules, which is a huge change in our system, because under the previous directive-based rules, almost all evidence was treated as commercially confidential. There was something called Article 20 of the previous directive, and it allowed companies to not publish or not make publicly available some of the data they were relying on in their clinical evaluation. That has changed to an extent. So in the future, we'll have something called a summary of safety and clinical performance. So that's a small summary for higher risk devices where you have to take the data from your clinical evaluation and show what you're relying on. And one of the other transparency changes is that for clinical investigations that happen under the new rules, there's a requirement to publish a clinical investigation report at the latest 1 year after completion of the study. So again, these will be great things for the system in general, and it will bring it a long way, but it's not active yet because the European database is not yet built. For people getting to grips with the new system, there's a huge number of new plans and reports and submissions to notified bodies and basically activity in the post-market. So you have to do assessments of any complaints and incidents, you have to screen literature. If you're a higher risk product, you have to send that compilation to a notified body. And essentially for companies, they're finding that it's not just increased resource demands to get to the market, but once you're on the market, there's now ongoing increased resource requirements. And the rules for clinical studies have changed. So it used to be just non-CE marked devices need an application to an authority and to ethics. Now we have rules for post-market studies of devices and something called other clinical investigations, which again is not defined, but is kind of framed towards academic studies of medical devices. And essentially these will either need an application and authorization, or for the post-market and other, often just a notification, but with a large amount of documents to the authority. So as to whether or not this will enter the UK system when they're looking at a redesign, we've yet to see, but if they adopt an EU type model in a close sense, these will be changes. And I guess this is just a slide to show under the old rules, clinical evaluation was quite a simple thing, arguably far too simple. You had your clinical data, which had that very broad definition. You could look at equivalent devices or talk about similar devices in your evaluation. You put it all into a compilation that didn't have very many methodological requirements. It wasn't like a systematic literature review. It's gotten a little bit more like that. And you'd send that to the notified body, and often that would be fine. And this is the old guidance that we used to have. It was replaced in 2016, but essentially it kind of lays that out. You identify, appraise, analyze, and make a decision. Do you have sufficient data or not? What we're finding with the new regulation is that clinical evidence, depending on the type of device you have, has gotten a lot more complicated. And I think companies and notified bodies are struggling to understand how to apply these requirements for their individual product. So I won't go through them in huge detail, but if you're something called a legacy device, if you were previously available under the directives, there's one pathway you can take and you can use your old data. You have to show it's sufficient, and no one has really given a clear description as to what exactly that means. There's a separate pathway for example, devices where data is not deemed appropriate and you have to give some justifications, or Annex 16 is a list of devices without a medical purpose, things like non-corrective contact lenses. But essentially what used to be a very simple pathway that was the same for all devices has now had a huge amount of complexity or choice built into it. So what are the current challenges in the system? So the group that Alan Fraser runs in Biomedical Alliance put out a press release over the summer that was pointing out that we now face a very real risk of the loss of essential devices in Europe. And from my perspective, there's three reasons for this. The cost has gone up enormously to have your notified body review. So in the past, I would have seen products get to market via notified bodies in certain parts of Europe where you could have paid €500 and you would get a CE mark. And now I'm hearing stories, and I'll show you a table in a minute, where it costs hundreds of thousands of euro. And the time has gone up, so it's gone from, often it would have been maybe 3-6 months. It can now on average take 6 to 18 months, and for some devices it takes 2 years of assessment time with your notified body, where they're asking you questions and everything is under assessment. And especially for small companies, a 2-year assessment timeline, where the outcome is perhaps not entirely certain, is a really challenging thing to fund. So some of the effects that we started to see, so when I was still working as a regulator around October of last year, a number of people came via the European Society of Cardiology and mentioned that they saw that devices were starting to disappear from their practice. And since that time, there's been a huge amount of work. Again, the Biomed Alliance have done lots of questionnaires and brought together different representative groups. And this is a paper myself, Alan Fraser, and 2 pediatric cardiologists worked on. I think we have a real problem with orphan or pediatric devices because these are characterized by low volume sales and often a smaller return on investment. And I guess when you put the costs up and the timeline up, but vitally when you put the predictability much more uncertain as to whether you can get your product to market, that's a very dangerous mixture that will possibly hit these types of products and interventions most. So we talked about a Rashkin balloon catheter where there used to be 3 of these in Europe. 2 of them left the market, we're down to 1 now, and that product is scheduled to leave the market next July because its certification to continue marketing will be lost and its notified body assessment will continue for months after that. So we're starting to see some very real consequences, and I guess for anyone who can influence policymakers in the UK, I would say take note and be aware that we're starting to see real changes in market dynamics. And this is just to show you from that paper some of the changes. So you can see for the medical device regulation for that Rashkin balloon catheter, the quote they got was €135,000 and it will take 18 to 24 months. And for that reason, that product may be lost from the market. It follows a 510K pathway in the United States, but you can see the cost there is €3,000, and that's for a lifetime marketing for the product, whereas in Europe it's every 5 years it has to be updated. This is a report from the Boston Consulting Group. I think Alan mentioned it earlier also. They talked to about 110 people from medtech companies, a lot of them US, and the headline figure that Alan mentioned also, that 89% of them are now prioritizing market launch elsewhere. And from my experience in the university, when I talk to small startup and spinouts, they will tell you exactly that if they get to the venture capital funding stage and they mention Europe as a launch market, they're looked at witheringly. Someone told me that someone came to them and asked, was there something wrong with them when they were mentioning they were thinking of EU as a launch market now. But this again is a big challenge for the sector. Other things that we're seeing at the moment is that under these transitional rules, where you can use your old directive certificate to continue marketing, you can't introduce iterative changes, which is an enormous part of the device system. Making small changes to the design is one of the big distinguishing features of devices versus drugs, and you can't do that under your transitional provisions. So we're seeing the next version of a TAVI or whatever launched elsewhere, not possible in Europe. Small companies are finding a really hard time because notified bodies, I've heard stories where they'll say, come back in 2 years and we might put you into the queue then. And if you're a small company, depending on your funding, that's death to them. They have to find an alternative market. I guess thinking then about all of these changes in device regulation and where IDEAL might be able to help. So there has been some improvements in medical device regulation in a clinical methodological sense, but it hasn't been profound, and I think there's a lot more that we need to do. When you look at the standard, which is what we call our GCP type standard for clinical studies, ISO 14155, that was revised in 2020 and it introduced a taxonomy, so just a naming for study phasing, first in human, pivotal and post-market. It's in no ways as nuanced as the IDEAL type considerations, but it's one of the first times when study phasing has been brought in to encourage sponsors to think about it. When you look at the wording in the regulation itself, it now requires people to justify the level of clinical evidence, but doesn't say how you describe that level. I'll show you the wording for it in a minute. And in guidance documents, so this is one of the guidance documents in the working group I worked at, there's what's called a suggested hierarchy, which is, again, it's not a hierarchy in the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine sense, but it lays out a regulatory type hierarchy. So I'll show you that briefly as well. And I guess in general, we're looking at an increased amount of clinical evidence for devices, but I think what we're finding in the system is knowing exactly for your index product when you need a study and what it should look like is a real challenge because the system cannot tell you in advance. So I guess this is that wording from the medical device regulation. Companies all now in their clinical evaluation have to specify and justify the level of clinical evidence, and they have to do that in light of the device and its intended purpose. So I guess that will hopefully start companies rationalizing it. You won't see it because the clinical evaluation is not public, but at least it's something that people are working on a little more. I guess this is just taking from the guidance document with that suggested hierarchy. You can see the kind of way that it's phrased, so high quality clinical investigations, but high quality is not further defined, for all variants and indications and patient populations, and it goes down. It's actually a 12-point list, so I won't go through it all, but there is something of a hierarchy, and this will be one of the first times that's taken into a European Commission guidance document. And I guess what are the opportunities where IDEAL might further integrate? So I guess it was mentioned already, there's a Core MD project. This is one of the things when I worked as a regulator that gave me great hope. Alan Fraser here is running that entire project. It's funded by Horizon 2020, and it has a number of things looking at the clinical evidence for high-risk devices, and Peter has a work package as part of it. The outcomes of that project will hopefully help to influence regulators because the Commission was really interested in helping to frame that call. And something called common specifications is a new tool in the regulation. It allows you to, for the first time, create clinical requirements that are specified by technology. We don't have any of these yet, but hopefully we're starting to turn the ship a little, and the acceptance that we're going to need more specific guidelines is hopefully coming. Expert panels, they give opinions as part of what is colloquially called scrutiny, but hopefully from next year, Alan mentioned this also, there may be scientific advice available from those panels because we're finding predictability is a real challenge, and getting those expert panels to give advice would be fantastic. Figuring out, and I guess it's almost Brexiteer type wording, but utilising the opportunities of your freedom now that you're outside of the EU, there's a number of initiatives that I've seen elsewhere. So for example, the Japanese regulatory authority, PMDA, and the US FDA have a really interesting thing called harmonization by doing. And essentially that acknowledges that our legal systems are different, but yet if we get the regulatory assessors working together on similar clinical studies, they can learn from one another and try to harmonize. So there could maybe be opportunities like that for MHRA. And I guess trying to see for things like device iteration or for equivalency, which is still going to be a large part of the system, how could IDEAL work with that? Because that's kind of the working language of regulators. And there's also, just to briefly mention, there is an ISO standard under development, or is going to start development soon, on clinical evaluation We've yet to see what the detail of that will look like, but that could also be an important thing for the system. So I guess just in conclusion, and I'll stop then, so you've probably seen already in these 10 or 15 minutes, the MDR is technocratic, by which I mean it is full of process and procedural rules and requirements. And I guess that clinical evidence generation in Europe, it requires a large amount of documents to show what you're doing and process requirements, but the actual underpinning of scientific principles to justify what the studies are that go into these documents is not quite there yet. And I've been really impressed. I got to join some of the meetings yesterday where we looked at some of the things that are happening in Oxford. You know, seeing the agile methods for really high quality evidence generation, I think is really fantastic. And we have to try and find some way to get better models for these integrated into the regulatory system. And to me, the world of evidence-based medicine, or how we rationalize our principles for clinical science, and the regulatory rules, these will have to move together, but I really honestly don't know when. So I'll just finish with this last quote. This is Rudolf Virchow, who we will know from his supraclavicular nodes, but he said, "Medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine at a larger scale." So it's been great to see the initiatives here, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a whistle-stop tour, amazing oversight. We're not going to take any questions because we have to leave the lecture theatre now, I'm afraid. But please, you're staying for the rest. Well, please, we can talk about it over tea or later on. So thank you very much. And we'll draw this session to a close. Tea's served in the room where we had lunch.